Yo, what's good, my great sages? It's your host, Sage D right here, now here today to bring y'all a new What If. This being the What If movie, to what if Deku had Kaidos' abilities. Thank you to the person who recommended me this What If. I hope you as well as everyone else enjoys, as today we're going to see exactly how things would go if Izuku Midoriya from the world of MHA had the abilities of King of the Beasts Kaido. As now with that being said, y'all, I got nothing else to say, so with that being said, let's get started.
You're never gonna make it, you're not good enough. There's a million other people with the same stuff. You really think you're different? Man, you must be kidding. Think you're gonna hit it, but you just don't get it. It's impossible, it's not probable, you're irresponsible. Too many obstacles, you gotta stop it, yo. You gotta take it slow, you can't be a pro. Don't waste your time no more. Who the fuck are you to tell me what to do?
Alright, so to begin the What If, we're now gonna start off with Deku's origins. So we now enter this What If where we see a small child, as we end up seeing this child currently getting picked on by Bakugo and his lackeys. We see Bakugo laughing obnoxiously as he will be picking on the child along with his lackeys before suddenly they will then hear the sound of someone screaming. Now this will cause them to look around wildly before Bakugo would then turn to his right, only to get kicked in the face by none other than Deku, who is smiling wildly at this point. Now this will cause Bakugo to be sent flying as he ends up bouncing on the ground a little bit, with his friends chasing after him to see if he was okay, but Bakugo ends up shoving them aside to get a better look at Deku as he then glares at him. Now Deku would be there in front of the child as he ends up laughing a little bit as seeing the foot imprint that he left on Bakugo's face, asking Bakugo if he was alright. As he would say this, obviously knowing that Bakugo was going to get mad at him for even asking if he was alright, which it did, as Bakugo would get up glaring at Deku, asking him exactly why was he intervening, with Deku simply saying because he could. That was the only reason why he did it. And this will cause Bakugo to then be enraged, as without any hesitation, he would then rush at Deku with an explosion as he tries to hit him. And Deku, seeing the explosion coming, would then suddenly smile as he would then spread his arms wide, as this is when he actually allows the attack to hit him. Now this will surprise all the boys except for Bakugo, who glares angrily, already knowing the reason why. As this is when suddenly the smoke would then clear, and when it does, they'll then all be surprised except for Bakugo as they see Deku would be completely fine, as he tanked the attack, with the only thing being damaged being his clothing. As Deku would then be shown having a wide grin on his face as he looks directly into the face of Bakugo before laughing, and Bakugo, seeing Deku was not taking him seriously, would then throw another explosion, and then another one, and then another one, as he begins to barrage Deku with explosions while everyone else watch. Now Bakugo's lackeys begin to call him out, saying that he was going too far, but Bakugo tells them to shut up, getting even more angrier and causing his explosions to grow even bigger. And Deku would be there tanking all the attacks with a smile on his face before eventually we will then see Bakugo then get tired, as after all he was still a child, as he ends up having his hands fall down as they will be hanging onto his sides, as he looks at Deku with a tired but angry expression. And Deku, seeing this, would then smile, as he just calmly grabs Bakugo's head before telling him to then grit his teeth. And Bakugo would actually do so, already knowing what was about to happen, but still ends up cursing Deku nonetheless. And Deku smiles, as this when suddenly one uppercut would then be sent directly towards Bakugo, causing him to then be sent flying into the air. As he would be sent flying so high that would cause everyone to gasp in shock, as Bakugo would then be sent over 20 feet in the air before slamming hard into the ground, and actually landing right where his friends were, which was quite a few distances away. All the while Deku, taking in the entire scene, would then be laughing, and I mean full on belly roll laughing, as he was actually currently right now on the ground, hitting it multiple times, just laughing at how far he sent Bakugo flying, before calming down as he then gets up, telling Bakugo that it was a good fight, and that he expects a rematch. As just like that, we will then see Deku walk away, with the kid that Deku had supposedly saved be right there behind him, thanking him for the help. And Deku would then suddenly stop moving, as he would then have this ominous energy just surrounding him, causing the kid to tense up, and also causing Bakugo's lackeys who were about to take Bakugo to the nursery. As this is when Deku would then turn to the kid that he had saved, as he looks him directly in the eyes, before suddenly he would then speak. Who are you? And this would cause everyone to literally faceplant except for Deku, as this is when Deku would then suddenly walk away with a smile on his face, telling the kid that he was weird. As little did Deku know that he actually saved the kid. Literally everything that he did it because he could, but there was no real intentions beside actually wanting to fight Bakugo. That was it. And actually, that would actually be the entire base of Deku's personality. As we now do a flashback. dating back all the way up to the beginning of the year, we would already see Deku expressing signs of being completely different compared to the other kids. As you see, when Deku was enrolled into the school thanks to Inko and everything, we already see Deku being completely different from the rest of the kids. As although many of them were shy, many of them were outgoing, none of them were like Deku, considering the fact that Deku was extremely wild. So wild in fact that literally halfway through the class he would literally leave. As while the teacher was paying attention to the other kids, Deku would actually end up getting out of the classroom and just go on his own adventures. And he would do that throughout the rest of his time in kindergarten. Or at least he did do it throughout the rest of the time until quirks began to develop. As when quirks began to develop, Deku began growing excited, as the very first quirk that was awakened would be none other than Bakugo. As Bakugo would awaken his miniature explosions right in the middle of class. And Deku, seeing those explosions, would then grow extremely fascinated, as he couldn't help but wonder if with those explosions, Bakugo could give Deku a good fight. As you see, every single time Deku would go on those little adventures, he would slowly but surely begin to develop a extreme hunger for battle. As whenever Deku would encounter an animal, he would constantly actually try to provoke it to fight him, to which most of the time it would, only for it to be folded by Deku. And it wasn't just animals, it was also people as well, as Deku would constantly try taunting some people to get into a fight with him, which actually occurred, although it was pretty rare, and half the time it would just mostly be a thug with a extremely shitty quirk, and I mean extremely bad, and Deku was somehow able to beat them too. As for some odd reason growing up, Deku was just unnaturally strong, and he was so strong in fact that even those with quirks couldn't really beat him, with the most obvious case being none other than Bakugo. As sometime during the school year, we would actually see Deku challenge Bakugo to a fight, with Bakugo accepting mostly because of the fact that by this point Deku was still quirkless. So due to that, Bakugo had made the assumption that Deku would be pretty easy to beat. But unfortunately for Bakugo, he was wrong. As the very second he charged at Deku with the explosion, Deku would actually rush at Bakugo with even greater speed and strength, as he just completely dominates Bakugo and just completely mollywops him, all the way up to the point where Bakugo would be laying on the ground completely beaten up, all while Deku would be looming over him being completely fine. And this would be a cycle that would be repeated constantly throughout the time of them growing up, with Bakugo constantly being the one to get challenged by Deku and him obviously accepting it as he wants to beat Deku, but no matter how hard he tries, he unfortunately was just never able to do so, as these actions would follow them all the way up to the present, as we now do both a change of scenes as well as a time skip. So we now open up the scene with Deku as we currently see him getting taken to the doctor after a long day of school, and also after that fight with Bakugo. Now Deku would soon arrive there, as currently right now he was getting tested for a quirk, and after getting the results it would then prove that Deku does in fact have a quirk, in this timeline at least. As after finding out this realization, Inko was extremely happy as she thanks the doctor for his time before taking Deku back home. And now turning to the next following days, we will see Deku as he just continues on with his regular activities, and for the most part things remain calm, until eventually it was finally time for his quirk to then awaken. It was just nothing more but a typical day, as Deku will be casually fighting Bakugo, with Bakugo obviously getting his butt kicked, considering the fact that he really just couldn't do anything to Deku. As after Deku would beat Bakugo for like the umpteenth time, Deku would then decide to go on his own adventure, as he decides to leave class early and just simply head off. Now during this time we see Deku as he just ends up moving throughout the entirety of his neighborhood, or really just the city that they were in. But as Deku was doing this though, this is when suddenly he would then encounter a villain. And no, I'm not talking about the regular thugs that Deku will be facing off occasionally, I'm talking about a true villain. As currently right now, Deku will see an actual robbery happening in progress, as we end up seeing a villain with a mutation type quirk currently right now trying to run away from the law, as he has seemed to rob something from someone. And Deku would be there watching it all, as this is when he has a smile on his face. As seeing the person's quirk as the person looked quite big and intimidating, it would cause Deku to immediately think that that guy would most definitely give Deku a good fight. So with that being said, this is where we would then see Deku then jump, as right in front of the villain, right as he was trying to escape, Deku would appear right in front of him before punching him in the face. Now this will cause the villain to actually sway off its path, as he would then crash into a nearby shop, causing even more property damage. As Deku would be there watching it all with a smile on his face, as he then tells him to bring it. And the villain, being outraged by the fact that Deku was trying to get in his way, would then rush at him with high speeds. These speeds catching Deku off guard, as is when suddenly the villain would then hit Deku. And to Deku's surprise, when he gets hit by the villain, not only does he get sent flying, but also he actually gets hurt by this. As you see, Deku, although he was most definitely way tougher and stronger than a normal kid and everything, at the end of the day, you still have to remember that Deku was, well, technically still a kid. He wasn't so strong enough to a point where he's already All Might level and stuff like that. So due to that, after Deku got hit, he actually took some pretty massive damage from it and even fell into unconsciousness. As this would end up making it seem as if the villain was now truly going to get away, as he tries to make his escape once again, with people that were in the surrounding area screaming in panic after seeing the damage that was done. But as Deku was on the ground, as we see him currently unconscious, this is when suddenly we would then see his skin then transform into a bluish color. As we now change our perspective. Changing attention, this is where we now turn to none other than Aizawa. As currently right now in a different location, we end up seeing him going through his regular rounds of grocery shopping, as today was supposed to be a casual day before he goes into hero work. As you see, he usually does his hero work at night, considering the fact that, it just simply works better for him. So that meant that the entirety of the day was mostly just his off time. Or at least it was until, class started once again for UA. But as Aizawa was doing this though, this is when suddenly he then stops, as he ends up hearing a bunch of people screaming, as well as he could feel the ground itself rumbling. Now Aizawa would be confused as he begins looking around, until suddenly he would then look up into the sky to see something completely shocking. As currently right now, looming over the entirety of the city will be none other than a ginormous blue dragon. Now this will cause Aizawa to look at it in complete shock, while everyone else will be screaming out in panic as they try running for their lives. As this transformation alone was so powerful, they destroyed the area where the dragon once was, which if you guys obviously have not connected the details, the dragon is Deku. As the entire area where Deku had once was now almost nearly wiped out, as literally Deku's transformation had caused so much collateral damage in that small time span, especially since he wasn't really in control. As Deku himself will be in this dragon form, but you could see that something was off, mostly by the fact that there was no pupil in his eyes and he was just floating around anxiously, as really he was just moving for the sake of moving and nothing else. Now when Aizawa sees this, he immediately gets into action as he tries his best to help out the people that were trying to escape all the destruction that was happening, as Deku's movements were already causing generous amount of shockwaves and were causing small miniature damages all around the city. And Aizawa, seeing this, was trying his best to make sure that the crowd was calm and try his best to work around it. Cursing himself for the situation, this is when Aizawa then decides to turn his attention onto this ginormous dragon. But just as he does so, the dragon, almost sensing Aizawa, would then suddenly turn to him. And almost as if it was running on instinct, this is when it would then open its mouth, as he then begins to charge up a ginormous ball of energy. And Aizawa, he was not dumb. When he saw that, he knew if that attack was released, he would be dead. Alright, it just simply didn't matter. And it wouldn't just be him, the entirety of the city could have been wiped out by that attack. And he could see that it was growing in power more and more, which meant that damage could be more and more. So seeing this, Aizawa immediately act. He tried his best as he goes ahead and activates his quirk immediately. And when he does, he actually ends up seeing that this ginormous dragon begins to actually grow smaller and smaller, as it seems to be transforming back. This will actually cause him to smile in relief, considering the fact that he thought at first that this was a mutation type quirk. And if that was a mutation type quirk, then his abilities may not actually work to the fullest at this very moment. Considering the fact that while he may stop the breath attack, that thing was still extremely large, which means that his chances of winning against it was pretty slim to nothing. So seeing this ginormous dragon shrink smaller and smaller would cause Aizawa to actually sigh in relief, before suddenly he would then rush towards the dragon, or at least the person who had transformed into the dragon, so that way he can actually send them to jail. As he begins rushing there as quickly as possible, as the dragon continues shrinking further and further, about to go back to its regular form, this is when the dragon would then release one last roar, and when it does, it then ends up releasing a powerful wave of energy. And this energy was so powerful that it caused Aizawa to actually hit the ground extremely hard, as his whole body seemed to shut down on him. And he was not the only one. Many people around the area that was running away or screaming or hiding and everything, they fell into unconsciousness, as literally that aura was so powerful that they couldn't actually resist it, and it forces their body to literally shut down on them. Now this would cause Aizawa to actually be semi-conscious, luckily, as this wave that he got hit by, it didn't seem to be concentrated, or better yet, it didn't seem to be at a high enough level to where it can keep him out of the fight completely. So after taking a couple of deep breaths and restabilizing his body, Aizawa would then once again rush towards where the dragon had landed, so once again he can try to put this person in jail. But when he finally ends up arriving there, and in order to see who exactly it was, imagine his surprise when he ends up seeing none other than a child. As currently right now just laying there in the crater and looks like to be calmly sleeping will be none other than Deku. As Aizawa will be looking at the situation as if it was completely foreign to him. I mean, he heard about people with quirks that had generous mishaps. I mean, it was not new, especially when it came to the early developments of Quirk, but this was something else. I mean, this kid was literally about to level an entire city if Aizawa wasn't here right now. And just thinking about it would cause Aizawa to release a troublesome sigh, as he would then rush at Deku as he was still sleeping, unaware about all the chaos that he had released at that very moment. As this is where we now end up doing a time skip, as well as a change of scenes. So flashing forward, after all the events that transpired, we end up seeing Deku once again, this time sitting right next to his mother, as she was currently right now having a discussion with Aizawa. Cause you see, after the events that happened between Deku and the rest of the city, currently right now, Aizawa had no choice but to actually look up information on Naruto, where he eventually found out about where the school he went to, as well as where his mother is. So after going ahead and calling up Deku's mother from her job, she had to come down there to actually speak about the whole incident. And when she found out about what had occurred, Inko nearly had a heart attack. But luckily, after Aizawa had calmed her down, eventually they then begin discussing, where Aizawa then actually brings up an offer, as he would end up discussing with Inko about adding Deku into UA. And the main reason for this was because of the fact that Deku's abilities are very dangerous and very uncontrolled, making him a danger to not only everyone around him, but also to himself. So due to that, Aizawa thought it was a good idea that Deku gets enrolled into UA. And more precisely, it's better for him to go to UA specifically, considering the fact that if someone or something else ends up taking Deku, then this could end up leading to even more problems down the line in the future. And Inko, after hearing about all this, she of course was very much worried for her son, but after thinking it over, she thought that it was the safest option, so she decided to agree to it. And after a long time of discussing, and after signing a few papers, this would be where Deku's story would truly begin, as this will be the very beginning of Deku's time of joining UA, as we now end up doing a massive time skip. So we now pick up the story once again, as we end up flashing forward through multiple different events that happen in the story. The UA entrance exam, as Deku is not a part of that. The Quirk apprehension test, Deku is not a part of that. And heck, even the battle trial, Deku is not a part of that. He is not involved in any of these three. But you see, the thing is, this is where we now enter the USJ arc. Because you see, by this point now, the rest of Class 1A has been assembled and everything, as currently right now, they were making their way over there to just go through their regular training and everything. But while they were on their way there, unknown to them was the fact that someone was following them. As we end up seeing that as the bus was making its way over there to the USJ, currently right now in the trees would be someone else watching them, as he ends up cackling in anticipation before dashing off at amazing speeds. Now soon afterwards, as the students would end up arriving at the USJ, immediately all of them look around in fascination and amazement at just the surrounding area. But while they were doing this is when suddenly portals begin to open up. Villains had arrived, as immediately they begin to cause trouble. Now Aizawa would immediately jump into action as he tries his best to protect his students, 13 doing the same thing. But soon afterwards, after fighting for quite a while, they unfortunately were not able to hold off completely, as we end up seeing many of the students get teleported away and all of that, but the rest of them were already having a pretty much of a rough time trying to warn the other heroes so that way they can help them. So the situation was looking pretty dire. But just as if things were about to get worse, as we end up seeing Aizawa actually now getting jumped by the Nomu, this is when suddenly they would then hear someone laughing. And not only that, but they would also hear the sound of something falling from the sky. Now this would cause many of the students, and heck everyone around, to look around for a little bit, before finally they look up into the sky to see someone smashing through the very roof of the USJ, as this person would be falling at such fast speeds that would cause literally everyone to not be able to see who it was. But for some weird reason, Aizawa knew who it was, as we could see a small grin form on his face even after this individual had landed so hard into the USJ that it caused a ginormous crater to appear, and not only that, but it shook up the entirety of the USJ itself. Now we end up seeing smoke begin to fill in the entire area as many people anxiously begin to send it away in order to see who actually arrived here, with many of the students hoping that it was All Might and many of the villains hoping that it wasn't. As they go ahead and look on in anticipation as this person was laughing and laughing before finally their appearance would then be revealed. As currently right now, standing in the crater and having a ginormous wide smile on his face will be none other than Izuku Midoriya, as he'll be looking around as everyone will be looking at him in shock before suddenly Deku would then turn his attention onto Aizawa, who was of course trying his best to escape the Nomu and everything, considering the fact that his arm got pretty damaged by Shigaraki. As this is when Deku would then glare at Aizawa before suddenly screaming at him, asking him why exactly didn't he invite him here. With Aizawa after hearing this sighing, as he then reminds Deku about the events that had transpired, as well as the fact to remind Deku that he had been punished by not only just Yue but also his mother. And this caused Deku to immediately begin to get embarrassed as he just scratches the back of his head while looking off to the side. Now everyone will be confused by this banter as they almost completely forget about the fact why they were even fighting in the first place before finally collecting themselves. They didn't know who this guy was, but unfortunately it seems as if he was going to get in the way, as many of the villains that were there would then suddenly rush at Deku, telling him that he shouldn't have came here in the first place. But Deku, even though he was in front of all these different villains as they were rushing him, this is when suddenly he then begins to smile. As just like that, as every single one of these villains would then approach Deku, they would then be hit by a powerful wave of energy. So powerful that it causes every last one of them to fall unconscious. This being none other than Conqueror's Haki. As Deku would be there looming over them as he begins to ask them why exactly were they even trying, since they were way too weak to even touch him. But just as Deku was thinking this is when suddenly he would then be hit in the face by none other than the Nomu that had just recently appeared. And this hit would actually push Deku back quite a bit, as Shigaraki thought it was fair to send Deku away after that little display. But to Shigaraki's surprise, after Deku gets hit in the face by the Nomu, we would actually see him only skid back a little bit before smiling, as he then reveals that he was actually completely unscathed by the attack. As we would see Deku have a ginormous smile on his face as he would then suddenly approach the Nomu before staring it down face to face, as this is when Deku then comments that it was strong and that he would like to fight it. And the Nomu, not at all understanding what Deku was saying, with the only thing that was running through its mind was to actually fight Deku and to kill him, would then try to attack Deku once again. And Deku, seeing the attack coming, would actually smile as he allows himself to get hit over and over and over again. As just like that, Deku would be there taking the attacks as they would be thrown at him and only getting pushed back little by little while having a wide smile on his face. Now this would surprise Shigaraki and everyone watching, as they're just trying to figure out who exactly was this kid, as they continue to see the fight between Deku versus the Nomu. As now turning our attention to said fight, we would see Deku there as he would just be there with a bored expression now after the Nomu would throw a couple more rounds of punches and pushing him back just a little bit more and more. As after a while, this is when Deku, in just moving so quick that no one could react, he would then suddenly catch both arms of the Nomu, causing it to freeze up in place. Now Deku would be there as he sighs, telling the Nomu that he has to come up with a better strategy, as this is when suddenly Deku would do something incredibly brutal, but also it would display just how strong he was. As using only a casual bit of force, we will see Deku just casually rip off the arms of the Nomu, as it would then suddenly end up screaming out in pain before jumping away from Deku as it tries to regain its balance. Now Shigaraki, seeing as this kid was able to easily take apart his Nomu, would be there wondering just who was he, as there was no report about who this guy was at all. But right before Shigaraki got a chance to make his assumptions, this is when suddenly he would then be kicked away by Aizawa, as thanks to Deku intervening at the right time, Aizawa wasn't as damaged as he was in the main timeline, giving him the ability to continue on fighting, as he then rushes at Shigaraki trying to restrain him and capture him. But right before he could do so, this is when Kodogiri would then intervene, as he immediately begins to warp Aizawa in a particular way that ends up trapping him. Now this ends up causing Aizawa to curse, But right before he could do anything, this is when suddenly he would then see Shigaraki's hand dangerously close to his face. And he still remembered exactly what Shigaraki's quirk did, as he ends up paling a little bit, but he still glares nonetheless. Now Shigaraki, instead of actually trying to kill Aizawa, he would actually try to interrogate him, asking him who was, well, Deku. And of course, after hearing this is when suddenly Aizawa would then smirk, as he ends up telling them that now that he was here, the chances of them winning went down to basically 0. And Shigaraki, after hearing that, would then begin to laugh in Aizawa's face before explaining exactly what the Nomu was meant for, explaining that it was meant to take care of the #1 hero, and there was no way that this random kid was going to be able to beat him, or so he thought. But this is when suddenly Shigaraki would then actually hear the cry of the Nomu, as he ends up turning to it only to be surprised when he ends up seeing the Nomu get sent flying, as it will be sent flying directly, well, right beside Shigaraki and slamming near the wall right beside him. Shigaraki would be there watching in complete shock as Deku was making his way towards the Nomu while stretching and having a wide smile on his face, as this is when he would then ask the Nomu if he still had more in the tank, with the Nomu grunting as it tries to get up. And Shigaraki trying to comprehend exactly what just happened, this is when Aizawa would then speak up, as he then says that if that is a device meant to kill the #1 hero, then it's a good thing that Deku was here, as he ends up stating with full confidence that the boy that they were watching right now would be the one to surpass the #1 hero. And just hearing this would actually cause chills to fall down Shigaraki's spine, as the Nomu would then get up rushing at Naruto, with Naruto smiling as he ends up releasing the Conqueror Spear once again, with this time actually hitting Shigaraki and also Kodagiri, causing Aizawa to be free once again as he ends up hitting Shigaraki in the face before getting some distance. All the while Deku, he'll be approaching the Nomu with a generous smile on his face as it then rushes at Deku, with Deku doing the same thing. Both of them will rush at each other before colliding with a powerful punch, so powerful that it once again sends a generous shockwave across the entirety of the USJ. But that was not the only punch, as soon they will begin to go blow for blow, with Deku laughing, asking the Nomu just how much it could take. As each one of Deku's punches were so powerful that the Nomu was nearly sent flying every single time. And this will be going on, causing a generous amount of wind to be pushing back everyone and everything that was in between their fight, as eventually after going around and just hitting everything across the USJ with their attacks, eventually it finally settled down to only just one last punch. And just like that, this is when both Deku and the Nomu would then swing at each other as they arrive at the center of the USJ where they originally were fighting in the beginning. As after one last punch, this is where we would then see the Nomu then be completely destroyed, as all the kinetic energy that it was able to absorb and everything was unfortunately way too much. And not only that, but the output that Deku released was way past the limit it could actually endure. As just like that, we would then see the entirety of the Nomu's body be completely obliterated, leaving only chunks of it left behind, as Deku would end up falling down to the ground as he ends up smiling, thanking the Nomu for the fight, even though he already knows that thing is long gone by now. Now by this point, we already end up taking a good look at the USJ, and already we could see it. The effects of the fights were everywhere. We end up seeing massive damage across the entire area. We end up seeing multiple different villains laid out on the ground, as many of them were caught up in the crosshair, or better yet, they were just caught up by Deku's Conqueror's Haki, which by the way, that was the safer option of the two, because the ones that were caught up in, the battle between both the Nomu and Deku, those ones were probably not even breathing after the collision. It was still unsure. And the only thing left was the students looking on in complete shock, as they were still trying to register the events that transpired. And they were not the only ones, as currently right now we end up turning our attention to Shigaraki, who is on the ground after getting sent flying by the shockwaves and the powerful winds from the punches, as he'll be there watching Deku in just complete anger, as he couldn't believe the amount of bullshit that he had just seen right now. A regular kid, the ones that they were actually attacking, had actually been able to beat his Nomu. It didn't make any sense at all, and here he was right now watching the impossibility actually happen. It just didn't function in his brain right now, as he'll be scratching anxiously, wondering why exactly did the universe create something like that. But while this was happening though, this is when suddenly Shigaraki's head would then be grabbed, as he would be then slammed face first into the ground, as he would then be restrained by none other than Aizawa. As while Shigaraki had been distracted by the fight, Aizawa had been luckily able to recover quickly enough, as he already gotten used to just how crazy powerful Deku really was, as after all, he was one of the few people that trained him. And after seeing that Shigaraki was caught off guard, and not only that but also seeing that Kodagiri was knocked unconscious due to the collision between both Deku and the Nomu, this will cause Aizawa to then make his move as he finally finishes restraining Shigaraki. As just like that, this is when Aizawa then makes it clear that Shigaraki and the rest of these villains are going to be sent away for a very long time. And Shigaraki, after hearing this, couldn't believe it, as he can't believe that all that planning, all that manpower had gone to waste. And to make it even worse was the fact that All Might hadn't even shown up. Legit, they were so insignificant that All Might didn't need to be here to beat them. And this just aggravated Shigaraki so badly enough to the point where he then releases a hellish scream, one so powerful that it could be heard everywhere. Now Deku, after hearing this, just calmly turns his head to Shigaraki as he scratches the back of his head wondering just who was he. As Shigaraki will be cursing out Aizawa, cursing out the students, and more precisely cursing out Deku, as he ends up telling him that he will remember this just as suddenly a weird sludge would then open up. As Aizawa and everyone that was watching would then look on in shock as both Shigaraki and Kodagiri had been teleported away. As of course Aizawa tried his best to stop it, but unfortunately he was way too slow. As unfortunately, even after everything that happened, both Kodagiri as well as Shigaraki had gone away. As Aizawa would look at the scene with a sigh, before finally turning to Deku as he was approaching him, as this is when Aizawa then tells Deku to just simply call for the other heroes, as he then falls into unconsciousness with Deku sighing as well, as this is where we now end up doing a time skip as well as a change of scene. So flashing forward to the next following days after the events that happened at the USJ, as by this point all heroes as well as authorities have been involved to clear up the entire incident, as well as to arrest all the villains that have been involved at the time during the incident. Now during this time, of course, Class 1A would eventually end up going back to its regular schedule, with all the students coming back in. But you see, while they were there though, this is when suddenly Aizawa would then enter into the room, as he's revealed to only have nothing more but a cast on his arm, as that was really the only big injury that he'd gotten. And after arriving and after taking attendance, this is where Aizawa would then begin to announce the introduction of a new student. As suddenly opening the doors of the classroom, we would then see walking casually as if nothing happened will be none other than Izuku Midoriya. As he walks up in there, saying hello to his classmates and causing everyone to suddenly just scream out, in complete shock, mostly because of the fact that they had no idea that the guy who took on a literal Nomu, and by that I mean he literally shattered it into multiple pieces and just completely mushed it up, was actually going to join their class. I mean, he was so strong enough to the point where he's already a pro hero in their eyes. But there was one person in particular who immediately glared at Deku. And Deku, after looking around the classroom and spotting that person, would then smile as well. As this one suddenly he would then actually begin calling out Bakugo's name, saying that it's been a while. But right after he says that and after he closes his eyes, this is when suddenly Bakugo would then appear right in front of Deku before slamming a ginormous explosion right into Deku's face, causing everyone to panic and causing Aizawa to just look at the scene with a twitch of his eyebrow and also a tick mark. As Bakugo would be there calling Deku a bastard, with Deku just casually eating the explosion as if it was nothing. He tanked that shit directly. And when he does, he'll be actually laughing at Bakugo, telling him that he's still too weak, but tells him to keep on trying. And Bakugo, after hearing this, gets angry as he tries to once again attack Deku, only to be interrupted by Aizawa, who tells them to stop and that it was too early in the morning for this. As just like that, we will then see both Deku and Bakugo go sit down, as class will then soon begin. As we now end up doing a change of scenes. So we open up this scene with none other than Deku, as we see him casually just eating a bunch of food while getting asked a multiple amounts of questions by his classmates. But the one most prominent in the room will be none other than Bakugo, who'll be screaming right at Deku's face, asking him where he's been, with Deku obviously laughing at Bakugo's face for every expression that he would pull. But right after eating his food, this is when Deku would then actually begin answering some questions, as for the main ones about where exactly he's been all this time and everything, more precisely to Bakugo, this is when it would then be revealed that Deku has been staying at UA. And more importantly, after getting taken in by them, he was actually getting trained to learn how to use his quirk. Now this would surprise everyone, considering the fact that Deku's quirk was apparently so dangerous that it actually got the attention of UA when he was younger. Now that was something that surprised him a lot, but it also surprised Bakugo more precisely, considering the fact that he didn't know that Deku had a quirk. As after all, throughout this entire time, he thought that Deku was quirkless, but now to find out he had a quirk was just mind-blowing. But now that Deku had actually answered this question, this caused a new one to pop up, what exactly was Deku's quirk. And Deku, after hearing that, would then smirk as everyone leans in anxiously before Deku then calmly tells them that he's not going to tell them. And this caused them to immediately fall down to the ground in face fault as they all begin to ask Deku why, with Deku smiling before finally explaining that the only way that he would ever reveal his quirk is when someone is actually strong enough to force him to do it. Now this response would end up causing tension to fill up in the area, with more precisely the much more stronger members of the class already looking at Deku with anticipation. As right before they can really begin to, get in the mood of challenging Deku to a fight, this is when suddenly the bell would then ring, announcing the end of lunch, as Deku and the rest of his classmates then return back to class, obviously. So now flashing forward to a couple of days now after Deku had been joined into the classroom and after getting to know his classmates and everything, as he actually built up quite a good bond between them and was already building up more connections. But while this was happening, eventually on a certain day, while Deku was actually packing up and everything, this is when suddenly as he opens the door, they will then be bombarded by none other than a bunch of other classes that wanted to check out Class 1A, as they especially wanted to check them out after finding out that they all had encountered villains. Now this of course caused many of the students to feel very awkward about the whole thing, before eventually Bakugo would then try to leave as well, but when he tries to do so, students begin to call him out and everything, with Bakugo telling them to shut up, mostly because of the fact that to him, they were all irrelevant. Now many of them will be pissed off by it, but Deku personally didn't care, as in fact seeing all these students here, this is when he then smiles, as he didn't ask them if they want to fight him. As right after saying these words, this is when Deku begins to release a powerful intent, as this would not be Conqueror Spirit, as Deku did not see the need to use it. No, this would be something else entirely, as it would just be the casual wave of Deku's thirst for battle, as this thing will be so intimidating that it causes many people to actually make way for him, as none of them really wanted to fight him. Even Monoma, which was basically the biggest Class 1A hater and the one who would be most willing to put them in their place, immediately backed down after sensing that, as he barely had enough energy to even look Deku in the eyes, which it was very much frowned against, as many people couldn't even look him in the eyes. And Deku, seeing all these people immediately lose their energy, would then actually pull up a kind of sad expression as he just casually leaves the class while feeling down about it. And he would continue to feel down about it all the way up until the point where he would arrive home. Now when Deku ends up arriving home, he would see Inko there, as when she ends up seeing her son, she immediately rushes over to him, give him a hug, before the two of them would then sit down for a family dinner. Now after that family dinner, Inko would soon actually head upstairs to go rest, although Deku would stay up, and the main reason for this is because of the fact that he needs to train. As you see, the thing is, Deku, even though he was strong as a child, he did still need to train to grow strong, as after all, no matter how much talent you have, talent can only take you so far without some hard training with it. So with that being said, this is where we would then see Deku as he then continues on with his usual path of training, this being the fact that Deku begins to train in his haki, as this was an ability that Deku had awakened during the time of him training as a young child. As Deku, after awakening the ability, he would constantly train himself in order to master it, as he wanted to learn how to do it on command. And although it took many years to do so, eventually Deku was able to do it. But the thing is, Deku's strength right now is still not on the same level as it is to Kaidou that was happening in, One Piece. So yeah, Deku, he's definitely is growing stronger, but he's not Kaidou level just yet. But he is slowly but surely approaching said level. As we see Deku continue training for many hours at the night before finally heading to bed, as we now end up flashing forward to the next day. So when the next day rolls around, this is when Aizawa would then end up arriving in class before finally announcing to them about the UA Sports Festival. Now this will cause everyone to then begin to cheer in excitement, before finally this is when suddenly, and to surprise everyone, Todoroki would then get up as he then approaches Deku. As we end up seeing Deku himself just casually lay his head on the desk, as whenever Deku was not fighting, he was either sleeping or eating, and currently right now he was sleeping. Or at least he was, until Todoroki would then wake him up just by his presence. As this is when Todoroki, after seeing that he has Deku's attention, would then announce to Deku that he's going to beat him at the UA Sports Festival and force him to use his quirk. And after hearing this is when suddenly Bakugo then gets angry, as he immediately begins to erupt, saying that if anyone was going to beat Deku, it was going to be him. And Deku, after hearing that he was going to get pretty much two people to fight him, he would actually smile in anticipation, as once again the tension begins to fill up the entire area as Deku's hunger for battle begins to pretty much get unleashed, as he looks directly at both Todoroki as well as Bakugo with wild eyes as he tells them to bring it on. As this will end up making the rivalry between the 3 strongest people in Class 1A grow even further, and causing everyone in Class 1A to then cheer in anticipation for the UA Sports Festival, as every last one of them are hyped up for it. As this is where we end up doing a time skip due to a generous training montage for every single member of Class 1A. So we now pick up the story once again as we now start off the UA Sports Festival. The first portion of it would begin pretty similarly to the main timeline, and the outcome would remain the same, with Deku coming out on top after going through the obstacle race and taking care of the villain robots, as it was pretty easy for him. But after getting that first win, Deku would have more than 10,000 points just looming over his head, so due to that he goes ahead and makes an enemy of everyone, to which he wants it. As is where we now enter into the second event of the sports festival, the Cavalry Battle. With this event playing out pretty similarly to the main timeline, as Deku's team still remains the same, as they end up actually going through it much easier this time around. This being due to the fact that Deku actually has control over his abilities and is actually competent when it came to fighting. So due to that, Deku was actually able to maintain his headband and would actually end up still having the top spot by the end of the Cavalry Battle. Now this of course ends up pissing off everyone, especially Bakugo and Todoroki, but now it was finally time for them to actually have a chance to beat Deku, as it was finally time for the 1v1 matches. As we now change scenes. So we now enter the very first scene with the very first fight between Deku and Shinso. Now when Deku faces off against Shinso, I'm not gonna lie to you, Shinso tries to kind of, force Deku to, to speak to him so that he can get him under his control. But unfortunately, Deku was not having none of it, as after all, he more preferably would like to fight rather than talk half the time, or most of the time. So due to that, Deku just simply rushes at Shinso and knocks him out the ring. It was really that simple. Now this ends up causing a generous upset for everyone else, thinking that it was going to be a good fight, but unfortunately it just ended rather quickly, so they decided to move on. The rest of the matches remain pretty similar to the main timeline, all the way up until the point it's finally time for Deku versus Todoroki. Now this ends up causing everyone to buzz and attention, mostly because of the fact that they're looking at basically what they see in their eyes so far, the strongest person in Class 1A versus the son of the number 2 hero. So due to that, this causes everyone to start cheering in excitement, especially Endeavor, as he got so excited enough to the point where he soon ends up confronting Deku. As while Deku was over there in the waiting room preparing for the fight, Endeavor ends up approaching him, telling him that his only existence is to pretty much make Todoroki better. And when Deku heard this, he simply looked at Endeavor directly in the eyes before smirking, as this is when suddenly he ends up releasing a wave of Conqueror's Spirit. And this spirit was not enough to completely knock out Endeavor, as Deku had not mastered it enough to the point where it could do that, but it was definitely enough to the point where Endeavor actually was, off balance for a little bit. As Deku would then suddenly stroll past Endeavor, telling him that he's only here to have a good fight, and he doesn't give a damn about whatever Endeavor has plans for him. And when Endeavor heard this, he couldn't help but be shocked, as he would just be there looking at Deku wondering just who was this kid. As we now end up flashing forward to the fight between Deku versus Todoroki. Now when the fight first kicks off, we end up seeing both Todoroki and Deku staring down at each other, as when the match is then called to begin, Todoroki sends a ginormous wave of ice towards Deku. But when Deku sees this, he then smirks, as he just casually, with a simple scream from his voice, he's actually able to destroy the ginormous amount of ice that was sent towards him, and also causing Todoroki to be off balance, concerning the fact that he was not expecting that. Since half the time when Deku fights, he mostly just lets the attack hit him, only for him to be unaffected by it. But this time Deku actually decides to go on the offensive first. As is where we would then see Deku then kick off the ground, as he then rushes directly at Todoroki. And Todoroki, seeing Deku approaching at amazing speeds, tries to once again stop him with his ice, but Deku just casually ends up destroying them before finally appearing right in front of Todoroki and just suddenly backhanding him in the face, sending him flying. But fortunately for Todoroki, he had been able to catch himself right before he was really close into falling out the arena. So due to that, this ends up causing everyone to start cheering, as this is when Deku then tells Todoroki to give it his all. And Todoroki, after hearing this, tries to do so, using only his ice of course. And this will continue on for a majority of the fight, as we see Todoroki trying his best to kind of hit Deku with his ice and put him in his place, but unfortunately, Deku was just simply too powerful, as he just casually destroys the ice over and over again, while also delivering beatings to Todoroki. And I mean beatings that made everyone in the crowd wince, as this man Todoroki was literally flung up into the air, slammed hard into the ground. He was literally getting dragged all over the place while getting beaten up, as Deku would be enjoying the experience but feeling quite bored. As after another wave of ice gets sent towards Deku, this is when suddenly he just casually ends up clapping his hands together, causing a ginormous shockwave to actually destroy the ice once again. And Todoroki, by this point, you could actually see that he was barely standing, like this man was barely conscious, as he had overused his ice way too much. And not only that, but with the beating that Deku gave him, he was literally standing on his last legs. And just as it seems as if the fight is about to be over, as Todoroki looks like he's about to fall unconscious, this is when suddenly he would then reflect on everything throughout this fight. And not only that, but he begins to reflect on everything that he learned from it, as he actually takes a bit of inspiration from Deku, by the way, that Deku seems to live his life completely unrestrained, and he kind of wonders how exactly he's able to do it, and more importantly, if he was possibly able to do it as well. And as Todoroki would think about that over and over again, just as it seemed as if he was about to hit the ground, this is when suddenly he catches himself at the very last minute, as this is when he thinks that just for this one moment right now, that he was going to be able to be completely free. And just thinking about that, this is where suddenly flames would then erupt on Todoroki as he begins to activate the other part of his quirk, the flames. Now this causes many people to cheer and endeavor to immediately go crazy as he begins cheering for Todoroki, telling him to give it all he's got and put Deku in his place. And Deku, seeing the flames right in front of him and seeing how Todoroki was going all out, this is when he then smirks, as this is when he will then call out Todoroki, telling him that this very last attack will be the very one to decide the entire match. And Todoroki, after hearing this, would then give Deku a wide grin, telling him to bring it on. As just like that, everyone would watch in anticipation as Deku would then burst off the ground, as his haki was literally flaring, causing even more destruction. And both Midnight as well as the men watching all this, they didn't realize that they need to put an end to this fight right now. People could actually get killed from this. So they would try their best to prevent the attack, but unfortunately, even though they tried their best efforts, it was impossible. As after one last collision, this is where we would then see both Deku and Todoroki then collide for one last attack. And this attack would literally destroy the entirety of the arena, and not only that, but also cause a ginormous shockwave to fill up the entire stadium. As everyone gets pushed back by this, as they actually wonder what the heck was going on, until suddenly this is when someone would then point out something. As by the time that the collision was done and all the destruction was caused and everything, this is when someone would then point out at Todoroki. As we end up seeing Todoroki completely unconscious, slammed into a wall, and not only that, but he was out of the ring obviously, but there was also a wide smile on his face. As right before the collision, Todoroki had actually thanked Deku for actually giving him this opportunity. But now with that being said though, now that Todoroki was out of the arena and Deku was still in it, this is when suddenly Deku would then be declared the winner. As this would cause everyone to cheer, as they couldn't help but believe they actually saw a fight like that, as that fight was something equate to both pro heroes duking it out, or at least that's what some people would say. Now when Endeavor saw this, he was completely in shock and everything, as he couldn't believe that his son actually lost even though he used his flames. As he can't help but wonder what he did wrong, but right before he could think this, he would then look at Deku, who's casually there, showing that he barely took any damage at all, other than a couple of scrapes that were on his body, but other than that he was fine. And Deku, sensing the gaze from Endeavor, he would then turn towards him before smirking viciously. And Endeavor would then remember the message that Deku left for him right before he left. As Deku once again stated very plainly, he was here to fight and that was it, and he didn't give a damn about Endeavor's plans. And Endeavor, after remembering what Deku had said, he would be paling just thinking about it, as he just wonders who was this kid, as he couldn't fathom that there was someone else in this world that he actually felt intimidated by other than All Might. As just like that, with Todoroki and Deku's match now wrapping up, this is where we now head to the finals. So we now turn to the finals, as we end up seeing the entirety of the arena now completely fixed up by cement toss. As now by this point, the fighters would then begin entering the arena, as we end up seeing both Bakugo as well as Deku then arrive, with Deku having a genuine smile on his face, while all the while Bakugo would just be glaring at him. As just like that, this is where we would then get a little bit of a banter between the two of them, with Deku mocking Bakugo and Bakugo just plainly telling Deku that he's going to beat the living crap out of him, which of course Deku just simply laughs at. As just like that, after Midnight goes ahead and recollects herself, this is when she then declares the fight to begin. And immediately, without any hesitation, Bakugo would then rush at Deku, trying to slam an explosion at him. And Deku, seeing this, just like old times, would casually tank the explosion. But you see, the thing is, while Deku did improve a lot after he was separated from Bakugo and went to UA, Bakugo had done the same thing, as after all, he still needed a way to beat the kid who he thought was quirkless. So due to that, this is when Bakugo then firmly declares that it was not going to happen just like last time. As Deku would wonder what Bakugo meant, this is when Bakugo would then release another explosion, but this one being way stronger and way faster than the one from before. Now this one would actually surprise Deku and actually push him away a little bit. And surprisingly, that was not the only thing that Bakugo had in store for Deku. As with a wide smile on his face, this is where we would then see Bakugo then begin to release a generous horde of explosions onto Deku, with each one of them growing stronger than the last. And that was not the only thing, as after using his explosions to go up into the air, this is when Bakugo would then suddenly end up using his explosions to kind of make a flashbang, causing Deku to, immediately cover his eyes and causing Bakugo to gain more openings. And this would continue on for quite a while until eventually Deku would then end up laughing after another explosion, telling Bakugo that he's proud that he grew this strong. But right as Bakugo was about to land another explosion, this is when Deku would then casually grab Bakugo's arm. And right before Bakugo could even react, Deku would then casually toss him up into the air. Now this would have surprised everyone, but right as Bakugo was about to collect himself, this is when suddenly he would then see Deku appear right above him with his fist drawn back and everything, with the only closing thought in his mind wondering, how exactly did he get here before I even reached the air like that? It didn't make any sense. But right before he could even think about countering Deku, it was too late. As with a powerful punch to the chest, Bakugo will be sent flying and crashing down hard into the stadium arena. Now this will cause everyone to immediately, get hit with the blast of dust, considering the fact of how powerful the attack was. And honestly, to them and also to Deku, it looked like the fight was over. As after all, Bakugo got hit pretty clear, like that was a direct hit to his chest, so obviously they thought that Bakugo was going to be unconscious. But to the surprise of everyone, this is when as Deku was falling from the sky, he wouldn't see that Bakugo was still okay. He was still standing. As even after getting hit hard into the chest and slamming hard into the ground, he was able to pick himself up one last time and will be glaring at Deku, telling him that he was not going to go down so easily. And Deku, seeing this, would then laugh as he compliments Bakugo on his strength, telling him that this is something that he truly deserves. As this is when we would then see Deku's arm suddenly transform into that of a dragon's arm. As this is when Deku would then tell Bakugo that think of this as a sign of respect. And Bakugo, seeing his attack approaching as Deku is now falling towards him with his fist drawn back and everything, Bakugo would then release a ginormous explosions from both of his hands, ones that he could only get if he were to use the gauntlet. With these explosions actually causing Deku to actually stay up in the air a little bit longer, as it actually pushes him back up into the air. And Bakugo, using everything he has at this final moment, then decides to try to end the fight with his ultimate move, his Hauser Impact. As just like that, we would then see Bakugo then take up into the air as he then begins to spin like an exploding drill, rushing at Deku, with Deku seeing this laughing as he then draws back his fist once again, his dragon's fist, and also adds Haki to it. As just like that, we would then see the two of them then collide with each other, with Cementoss and Midnight trying their best to keep the crowd safe, with Cementoss even building up a generous wall to protect the crowd from damage. But unfortunately, even after trying their best on that, it still wasn't enough. As just like when Deku and Todoroki had faced off against each other and made that generous explosions, the same thing would happen here, but this time multiple times much more dangerous and multiple times much more destructive. As just based on the impact alone, it was able to shake up the entirety of the stadium and the arena and also cause massive damage all around. As it was so bad enough to the point where even multiple pro heroes had to get involved to stop the collateral damage that was getting caused from this attack. But finally, after the smoke would settle down and after the damage and basically all the debris had finally, fallen, eventually when the smoke clears, we end up finally seeing the winner of the fight. As calmly looming over the now unconscious Bakugo, we would then see Deku just calmly raise his fist into the air, similar to what All Might does, and this causes everyone to then cheer as he would then be declared the winner of the UA Sports Festival. As now with this being said, this is where we now end up doing a time skip. So we now turn to several days after the events that happened at the UA Sports Festival. And by now, finally things began to settle down for Class 1A, and by that I mean they got a chance to relax. But the one thing that didn't settle down was their popularity, as many people now knew of them not only for the incidents that happened with the villains, but also for the UA Sports Festival, causing them to grow even more popular. Now this of course made them all excited, but what also made them excited is the fact that now the internships were coming up. and while the internships were coming up, we also see that Deku just simply did not care. As even after winning the UA Sports Festival, he simply could not care less about the internship. But soon after everyone in Class 1A was then assimilated to their internships, and after they all got assigned, this would be when Deku would then be assigned for his own internship, as UA had decided to actually choose for him, as they decided to send Deku for the internship with the Hound Dog, which was a hero that was meant more for guidance counseling. And the main reason why Deku was sent towards him was because of the fact of Deku's just hunger for battle. As the thing is, Deku's hunger for battle was so overpowering enough to the point where it would cause many mishaps, so they wanted it to get under control. But not only that, but also Hound Dog was actually pretty powerful, so if Deku wanted to have a spar, then he should be able to give him a good fight. And needless to say, Deku had accepted it. As for the rest of this arc, things mostly play out pretty similarly to the main timeline, with the only real difference being the fact that Deku does not go to Gran Torino because he doesn't have one for all in this timeline, as instead someone else ends up taking Deku's place, causing this arc to pass by with no problems, or at least that's how it is in the surface. But as we end up taking a good look behind the scenes though, that's where we see something else completely different. Because you see, unaware to Deku and just the entirety of UA was the fact that someone was keeping tabs on Deku, as after many years of analyzing the boy, and after catching eyewitness accounts and finding out about what happened to the Nomu, and even seeing footage of the UA Sports Festival, this man has been planning Deku's downfall, and more precisely, his own uprising. This being none other than All For One. This man had been on an active hunt to find out about Deku ever since the events that happened at the city. As after all that damage was caused, All For One was deeply interested to find out exactly who caused it and what type of quirk it was. But unfortunately for All For One, no matter how many years passed, he wasn't able to find out exactly who it was, until eventually he began to get actual reports about a certain child. This being reports about, the events that happened to Class 1A, and also the report he got from Shigaraki, about a boy who had actually been able to best his own Nomu. Now this would cause All For One to get deeply excited, as he wondered exactly what is this boy's quirk. But unfortunately he was never able to tell until eventually it was time for the UA Sports Festival, and that's where he was only able to see a glimpse of it. But that small glimpse was more than enough to want All For One to want it, as after all, he wants many quirks in the world. But this kid's quirk seemed special, as during the time when he saw Deku face off against Todoroki and Bakugo, he saw that the boy had immense durability, strength, and not only that, but he also saw the boy's arm transform. And this already brought All For One's attention immediately, as he didn't know exactly what ability this quirk had, but already it seems as if the benefits were huge, as he sees enhanced durability, he sees enhanced strength, and also some type of transformation. So with all this information combined and all stacked up, All For One was more than willing to invest into Deku. Now the only thing he needed was the boy himself, but All For One luckily already had a plan exactly how to get to him, as just thinking about it would cause All For One to let out an evil smirk, as this is when suddenly he would then call up Shigaraki, letting him know about the next plan of action, as this is where we now end up doing a time skip. So we now pick up the story once again after the internships, as we now end up seeing all of Class 1A return. Now everyone immediately begins to talk about what exactly happened in their internships, before eventually it is when Aizawa would then enter, announcing that they're going to go ahead and have a little bit of an exam to see how much they have improved. Now this will make everyone of course very excited and everything, especially Deku, considering the fact that this means that he gets the opportunity to now fight someone, or at least that's what he thinks, as it is an exam. But unfortunately for Deku, in the beginning it doesn't really go that way, as they had to do a couple of obstacle courses, and not only that, but they also had to take an exam, causing Deku to be very much annoyed, before finally it was finally time for the practice test, where Class 1A would go up against the very teachers themselves. Now of course, seeing this, everyone was hyped up and everything, until eventually it would be finally time for Deku and Bakugo to face off against All Might. Now this would surprise everyone in Class 1A, but both Deku and Bakugo would be shown to have a wide grin on their faces, as this is when Deku begins laughing anxiously, as he can't help but believe he's going to fight the #1 hero, as that was something that Deku always wanted to do ever since he got to this school. As literally since the very first day that Deku got here and he actually was able to meet All Might, he wanted to face off against him. But unfortunately, every single time, All Might would deny the opportunity, as he always ends up telling Deku that he's still quite too young. But now, it was unavoidable. And yeah, Bakugo's here too. Now, eventually, after everyone settles down and everything, and as we end up getting to the practice zone, this is where we see both Deku as well as Bakugo now making their way through, as they begin to actually discuss about who's gonna be able to beat All Might first. Now, this ends up turning into a little bit of an argument before finally, this is when suddenly a generous wave of wind would then slam right into them, with this gust of wind pushing back Bakugo quite a bit, as he uses everything in his powers to make sure that he doesn't get sent flying, although Deku is actually able to tank it pretty well. With the only thing that really happens to him is him being pushed back just a little bit by it, but we can see a wide smile on his face. As just like that, this one suddenly walking towards them with an imposing aura just oozing out of him will be none other than All Might, as he ended up actually complimenting both Bakugo and Deku for actually not getting sent flying, as he ended up commentating saying that he can see the potential within them and he hopes that they give it all they got, go plus ultra. And just hearing this would cause both Bakugo and Deku to release a wide smile on their face, as just like that, both of them would then rush at All Might, as this is where the battle would then truly begin. We see Bakugo using his explosions to get much more of a lead on Deku, as he ends up trying to throw an explosion at All Might, only for All Might to immediately blitz Bakugo and give him a punch to the face, sending him flying. Then next up will be Deku, as he ends up reeling back his fist as he throws it directly into the face of All Might. Now All Might ends up dodging out of the way, luckily, as he ends up throwing a punch at Deku, only to be surprised when Deku's other hand shoots up and immediately grabs All Might's punch. And just Deku catching the punch would cause a ginormous shockwave to be sent out the entire area, as this will surprise All Might, as he can't help but think in his mind just how strong Deku was, as he then flashbacks to a conversation he had with Aizawa. It was supposed to be just a typical, evening at the office, as All Might would be there working and everything until Aizawa would end up pulling up. The two of them end up chatting for a little bit, each one of them talking about their classes, before eventually, this is when All Might would then ask Aizawa what was so special about Deku, as during this time, this would be during the time when Deku was just recently enrolled into UA. And Aizawa, after hearing this, then stops for a few seconds, as this is when he then begins to give a detailed report about the incident that happened. And this causes All Might to be very surprised about this, as he couldn't help but think just how dangerous it would be if someone like All For One got that quirk. But right after thinking this is when suddenly All Might would then ask Aizawa what was his opinion on Deku. And Aizawa, after thinking it over for quite a while, this is when suddenly he then looks at All Might with a determined gleam in his eyes, as he would then tell All Might with certainty that Deku may just be the one to surpass him. And this ends up shocking him to the very core. As we now turn back to the present, we see All Might as he continues on his battle with Deku, with both of them just slamming punches after punches with each other, with All Might being surprised as Deku punches were actually doing some pretty massive damage onto him, as most of the time when people were to throw or collide blows with him, they wouldn't really do too much to him. The only real thing that would really do too much to him if they attacked the only weakness that he had, which being the damage area. But Deku wasn't even attacking there. He was going blow for blow with All Might, fist to fist, and every single time All Might would feel a little bit of pain every single time. But right before things can escalate even further, this is when Bakugo would then enter into the fight, as this is when he tells Deku that he already had enough time spent with All Might, as he then slams an explosion right into the side of All Might's head. Or at least that's what he tried to do, as All Might was able to avoid it and immediately grab Bakugo by the face, as he then begins dragging Bakugo through multiple different buildings in the area. And Deku, seeing this, curses as he ends up dashing towards them. Now this ends up turning into a whole segment, as we end up seeing All Might end up shifting his attention to both Bakugo and Deku, as the two of them would just be getting their own 1v1 against him half the time, as either Bakugo will end up getting sent flying, allowing Deku and All Might to have a 1v1, or half the time All Might is able to actually escape from Deku to have a 1v1 with Bakugo. So basically he's shifting his attention to the two of them, giving them both equal attention, but he has to admit it's pretty tough considering the fact that Deku was doing some pretty good damage on All Might, and not only that, but All Might had to admit with the two of them here actually fighting, at different times and everything, it's actually proving to be a very effective method considering the fact that All Might was having some difficulty keeping up. But as the three of them continue on with their rampage, this is when suddenly Deku then gets an idea. As while he was fighting All Might and everything, as the two of them were once again exchanging blows, this is when Deku then decides to release the Conqueror's Spirit, but this time he decides to combine it with a punch. And the output of this one was surprising, as All Might, when he gets hit by this attack, he will be surprised by just how much damage he felt from it. As legit, he felt the kinetic energy from that blow travel into his literal muscles. And I mean, instead of hitting the skin and everything like that, it literally traveled through his body. And this made him feel a tremendous amount of pain and also causing him to be sent flying. Now this would surprise everyone, as everyone that was watching this couldn't believe that Deku had legit sent the #1 hero flying, all while Deku himself would be laughing as he couldn't believe what he just learned. As for the next few moments while in this fight, we will see Deku trying to replicate this over and over again, but failing. Now eventually over time, as both Bakugo and Deku are fighting off against All Might, eventually All Might would reach his limit. As unfortunately, thanks to how much damage he was actually getting surprisingly, and not only that but thanks to his time limit, he couldn't continue on any further. So due to that, right before things can go out of control, this is when All Might would then calmly state that the battle was done, as unfortunately he couldn't continue on any further. Now this would surprise both Bakugo and Deku, until Deku then declares that it's not over yet as he tries to fight All Might. But just as he was actually about to throw a punch, All Might ends up dodging, and to the surprise of Deku, this is when All Might is actually able to knock him out. As right before Deku would fade into unconsciousness, this is when All Might then tells Deku that he still has a few more years to go before he's able to reach his level of strength. As just like that, we will see Deku collapse down to the ground unconscious, and just like that, this is when it would then be announced that both Bakugo and Deku had passed their practical exams. As this is where we now end up doing another time skip. So we now pick up the story once again as we see all the students now currently right now finishing all their exams as they're now preparing for the forest training camp. But you'll see, while everyone else was preparing for it, we also see Deku doing something else. As well, yes, he's preparing for it too, he's also getting some additional training in. Cause you see, after that fight with All Might, Deku had realized exactly what he could do with this Conqueror's Haki. Now just to be clear, he doesn't really know the name of, the ability that he's using, as to him all of it just seems to be a part of his quirk, but to us, we already know it's Haki, okay? But yeah, he was currently right now trying to learn the advanced steps of Haki, not that he knew of it, as he was slowly trying to get the better hang of it after his fight with All Might. So Deku will be doing that as well as preparing for the forest training camp, as eventually when it was finally time for all of them to go, they would go. And after one very long bus ride, they will soon end up arriving at the forest, where they end up meeting the very own Kitty Cat Squad. Yes, I know their actual, squad name and everything, but I don't really feel inclined to say that, so for now on, I'm just gonna call them the Kitty Cat Squad. Either way, after a little bit of introductions, this is when suddenly one of them would then use their quirk to immediately toss the rest of Class 1A into the forest, where basically a generous amount of battles will be waiting for them. To which obviously, just like the main timeline, they're able to get through it quite easily, as after that we will see multiple events happening at the forest training camp that play out pretty similarly, like meeting Koda, the rest of them getting acquainted and everything, Class B joining in soon later on, and everyone in Class 1A getting training, and also Class 1B as well. As Deku himself will be getting specific training from Aizawa, as the thing is, Aizawa has to be the one to always constantly be there when it came to training with Deku and his quirk, as he was the only one to keep it in check if things were to go south. But still, regardless of that, we see things continue on relatively the same as the canon, until eventually it's finally time for them to go out into the middle of the night to do the little trial. Now as everyone will be paired up with Deku saying that he was all alone, this is when suddenly weird events begin to happen, as turning to a very far distance away from the camp, we will then see the League of Villains then pull up. As just like that, this is where chaos will then begin. As during the time in the forest training camp, we see Deku just moving around, doing his own thing, before finally, this is when suddenly he then stops. This being his Haki playing overtime, as he ends up sensing something's wrong, and more precisely, he can sense that something's wrong with Koda. As not liking it one bit, this is when we would then see Deku then move at incredibly high speeds to where Koda was located. And speaking of Koda, we will see him now getting confronted by Muscular, as Muscular will be looming over the boy, and Koda, getting a good look at Muscular's face, would then realize it, that this was a guy who killed his parents, and he would immediately call out Muscular for it, and Muscular, remembering Koda's parents and the injury they gave him, this would cause him to actually laugh at the fact that he was about to end an entire family's bloodline basically. But right before he could really get into the idea of doing so, this is when suddenly, as he was about to throw a hit at Koda, someone would then intervene, as he feels himself get hit hard by an unknown force and gets him flying. Now Koda will be there watching the person, as this will be none other than Deku, who had arrived in just the nick of time. And just like that, as Muscular will end up getting up, this is when he then takes a good look at Deku to realize who exactly it was, as he ends up commentating that Deku was their target. Now when Deku heard this, he said nothing more, as this is when Deku would then turn to Koda, asking him if he was okay. And Koda, after hearing this, would nod his head, as Muscular would grow angry at Deku ignoring him. Now, while Muscular was charging up and everything, this is when Koda then tells Deku to run away, or for them to run away at least, concerning the fact that he tells Deku that he stands no chance against the guy since he killed Koda's parents. And when Deku hears this, we would then see him then begin to release the Conqueror spirit in anger, as Deku's Conquerors was so strong that it was actually causing damage in the very place that he was standing in and causing cracks to be forming on the mountaintop that they were on. Now this would of course end up terrifying Koda, as this is when Deku then tells him to run for safety, or better yet just simply hide while he takes care of Muscular. And Koda would obviously do this, trying to get away, as Muscular would then rush at Deku, trying to hit him in the back of his head, only for Deku to then dodge sideways, as this is when he then tells Muscular that he was too slow. As suddenly backhanding Muscular in the face, we will see Muscular once again get sent flying, but right before he can really take off too far, Deku would then grab him by the arm and then bring him in to slam a punch to his gut. As this is where we then see the brutal sight, as Deku doesn't even play games with Muscular. There was not like that time where Deku goes ahead and laughs, allowing his enemies to hit him once or twice. No, he was not giving Muscular time to breathe, as Muscular would get bombarded blow after blow, as he ends up taking massive damage, since Deku was using this as training for his advanced Haki. As after a while of using Muscular as nothing more but his personal punching bag, this is when Deku then decides to finish it. As after landing one more powerful blow directly into the stomach of Muscular, this is when Muscular would then collapse down to the ground, and while his head was on the ground, this is when Deku would then suddenly end up transforming both of his arms into Dragon Fist, as Muscular of course being on the ground would be not able to see it, but right before he could even react, this is when suddenly he would then be barraged by multiple blows, with these blows being so powerful, they ended up destroying the entire mountainside that they were on. As just like that, by the time that Deku was done, Muscular is literally unconscious, bloody, and not only that, but he looks like he's literally nearing death's door. As Deku would look at him with an angry expression before spitting on Muscular to make sure that he remembers his place. As Koda seeing this would then rush over to Deku, thanking him as he gives him a hug, with Deku just patting him on the head before telling him that there's still more things to do. As by this point now, Deku is able to see that something wrong is happening, so with that being said, this is where he then picks up Koda and takes him to safety, and after taking him to Aizawa, he would then head off into the forest, ignoring Aizawa's call to stand back and let heroes actually take care of it. As now for the next following sequence of events, we see things play out pretty similarly to the main timeline, as we see all the events that are happening for Class 1A play out mostly the same, or at least it was until Deku would then intervene. As when it came to the time when Deku first encountered the teachers and facing off against the villains, he would help them out by releasing the Conqueror spirits. Now this would end up causing the villains to, of course, nearly fall unconscious, giving the heroes an opportunity to take them down much sooner. But while that was happening, this is when the hero would then let Deku know that now everyone was permitted to use their quirks, which was a good thing for the students, as immediately they try their best to fight back against the villains. As now with that being pushed aside, we see things play out for Deku pretty similarly to the main timeline, with the only real big difference here being the fact that Deku's arms aren't broken, which means he's actually able to help out. So that meant when it came to stopping Tokoyami, he was able to do so. When it came to meeting up with Toga and actually being able to put a stop to her, he was able to do so. And overall, Deku was not a liability during this time. But while this was happening and everything, eventually this is when they didn't take notice that Bakugo and Tokoyami had been captured, as that would still play out the same way. But right before Mr. Compass can get away, this is when suddenly, as Todoroki ends up making a generous wave of ice as Mr. Compass would dodge, this is when Deku, out of nowhere, he would then rocket up into the air before punching this man so hard that he ricochets into the ground extremely hard right in front of Dabi and Twice. Now this was a surprise the two of them, considering the fact that they weren't able to see it, and to even more to their surprise, they will see that Mr. Compass was completely knocked out. In fact, it looked like he actually died from the impact. But the only real sign that's showing that he was alive would be the fact that he's still breathing, somehow, some way. Now that Mr. Compass was knocked out, we would actually see his quirk then be released, as both Bakugo and Tokoyami would be freed, but still unconscious. But not for long though, as we see Bakugo then wake up, only for Twice to then try to intervene and get to him. But right before Twice got a chance to reach Bakugo, this is when Deku would then intervene, as he ends up landing a sharp kick directly into Twice's head, sending him flying, only for it to then be revealed that it was nothing more but a clone, as just like that, the rest of the students would end up arriving as well, along with the rest of the villains, as Toga would end up pulling up as well, and by this point now, it was now a standoff battle, as each side was waiting for the other one to make a move, as the tension would fill up the entire area before finally, they would then make their move. The fight then breaks out as Dabi tries to blast Deku with a generous waves of flame, only for Deku to dodge out of the way as he then rushes at Dabi, letting a sharp punch in his gut. Now this ends up sending Dabi flying, but right before Deku can try to, follow up on a combo, this is when suddenly Twice would then summon a bunch of clones to then jump Deku, to which he has no problem dealing with. As for the rest of this segment, we will see an all-out battle then be performed by both sides, as we see Deku and Todoroki, Bakugo, and even Tokoyami, as every last one of them will be facing off against the villains, with the villains trying their best to get everything under control. But while this was happening and everything was going on, this is when Deku would then sense that something was off, something was not right, and as he was continuing on fighting, this is when he would then realize it. As right in the midst of battle, this is when suddenly a black portal would then open up, as all they will see is nothing more but a hand then fall out of it, as this hand would then suddenly touch the ground, and just like that, the ground itself would then begin to decay. Now this ends up catching everyone off guard except for the villains, who end up smirking, as Deku himself would end up leaping up into the air trying to avoid the attack, but right as he does so, this is when suddenly another portal then opens up, as just like that, this is when Deku then realized it, that he fell for their trap. As you see, the main intention here was not to capture Bakugo and Tokoyami. It was exactly what Muscular had said. Deku was their target, and they had gotten him right where they wanted him. As Deku now finally coming to this realization, we would then see his fierce expression then fall, as he can do nothing more but sigh. As after taking one last look at his classmates, who by this point were now seeing the predicament that Deku was in, this would be where Deku would then suddenly end up letting out a large laugh, as after looking them all in the eyes, this is when he then tells them that he will see them later. As after that, this is where Deku would then be absorbed into the portal, as Todoroki tries to reach out to him, and also Tokoyami, but unfortunately it was too late. As just like that, the villains had succeeded in their very mission, as the capture of Izuku Midoriya had been a success. As just like that, this will bring the end to the Flourish training camp, as now that Deku had been captured, the villains themselves would then be warped away, as now just like that, this would be the very first time that Class 1A has truly suffered a loss, as this is where we now end up doing another time skip. So opening the scene once again, we end up seeing everything now beginning to settle down, as by this point it's only been a couple of days since Deku had been captured. The rest of Class 1A has been so far trying to recover from everything that has happened, as many of the students were currently right now trying to get back to their normal lives, as they were given a break off of school as well, just to, calm themselves down and to relax. All the while the ones that were heavily injured were taken to the hospital. So now, needless to say, Class 1A was trying their best to recover from everything. But you see, while a majority of them were trying their best to recover, there was also a small group of them that were trying something else. Cause similar to the main timeline, just like how Bakugo was captured and Class 1A created a team to go save him, in this timeline the same thing was happening, but with Deku being captured. And the one to actually replace Deku on this one, who was gonna, help out when it came to rescuing, Deku, would be none other than Bakugo. Now, for people who are confused, like, oh, why would Bakugo go after Deku and everything, it's simply because of their rivalry, that's it. As he ends up making it very clear that there's no way he's going to let his rival be done in by some villains, and that Deku better not get beaten up by them, or else he's going to beat him up himself. Now, of course, it will cause many of the people who are in the group to laugh at Bakugo, which causes him to be pissed off, but still nonetheless, the plan was very similar to the main timeline. As thanks to Momo Yaoyorozu having the tracker in order to, find exactly where the Nomu was, and potentially where Deku was, this is where they then devise a plan to ask her for the device, that way they can find it, and soon afterwards they'll go locate Deku, save him, and then leave. And things were supposed to go exactly as it was according to the canon. But unfortunately for them, Deku was playing a whole different game. Because you see, changing our attention to Deku, we now see him casually, as he will be casually just sitting there, not at all restrained at all, considering the fact that they tried that but it didn't work. As the League of Villains were just there staring him down, making sure to keep watch, so that way he doesn't do anything. But the thing is, Deku not once since he's been here has made any active moves. In fact, it seems as if he has been doing nothing more but meditating. Now this would confuse them, as they would try to talk to Deku many times, but unfortunately, he was not opening up to none of them. Even as Shigaraki would try to talk to Deku, it just simply didn't work. Now this made Shigaraki very upset, considering the fact that if Deku continued on like this, then he would make All For One upset. But sooner or later, Shigaraki would stop caring, as after all, if Deku gets on their nerves any longer, then eventually Shigaraki would get the okay to just simply kill him, which he was more than willing to do so. As after the events that happened with the Nomu, Shigaraki has gotten quite a grudge against Deku. So due to that, he was just waiting for the opportunity to finish him off. But just as this would continue on for a couple of days, this is when suddenly, finally, Deku would break the silence. As for the first time ever, this is where Deku, as it was just a casual day, and as all the League of Villains would arrive, this is when Deku would then casually get up. Now this will cause them all to immediately turn their attention onto him, with Shigaraki immediately rushing over to Deku, telling him that if he were to move any further, that he would die. And this is when Deku, after hearing this response, would then laugh, as this is when he then tells him calmly that they have no idea exactly how long he's been waiting for this. Now they would be confused at this until finally Deku's game plan had been revealed. Because you see, ever since Deku had arrived here and he scoped out the League of Villains, he actually just realized how much of an opportunity he had while being here. He could listen to their conversations, he can see exactly what they're doing, and more importantly, he can even see who the boss behind this really was. Because Deku 100% doubt that someone as weak as Shigaraki had the ability to command these people. So due to that, Deku made sure to play his cards right and just simply waited patiently, and sooner or later he soon got many answers. As Shigaraki would try speaking to him, and even try mentioning Deku about All For One, who better yet he just simply calls father, but still, Deku knew who exactly was in charge. And after finding out this information, and after learning everything he could, this is when Deku finally saw the opportunity. As after all, he could literally wipe them out right here, right now, and even get the big bad's attention. Which means that basically, Deku's literally taking care of 2 birds with 1 stone. So with that being said, as Shigaraki would rush at Deku, trying to warn him that if he were to move any further, that he would die, this is when Deku would then release the Conqueror Spirit, causing Shigaraki to literally fall unconscious right beside Deku, and also the rest of the League of Villains. As this is when Deku would then calmly tell Shigaraki and the rest of them that in fact it was the reverse, because if they made any slight move against him, then he would gladly kill them, as Deku was not playing any types of games. And soon afterwards, as Deku would end up wandering around, eventually he would find the very device that they used to contact All For One, as this is when Deku would then casually end up calling him up. Now after a little bit of ringing and after waiting for a while, eventually All For One would pick up. And when he ends up hearing Deku's voice, he's actually pretty pleased about it before asking why exactly does Deku have access to communicating with him. And this is when Deku just calmly reveals that he will literally end the League of Villains right here, right now, if All For One doesn't pull up. Now when All For One heard this, he stayed silent for a solid moment, causing tension to build up, as this is when he then tells Deku that it's very unwise to threaten him. But Deku, after hearing that, would then begin laughing at All For One, as he then calmly tells him that he doesn't make threats, he makes promises. And this ends up causing more tension to build up around the room. As after hearing nothing in response to his promise, this would cause Deku to then laugh, as this is where he then begins to give All For One the terms. But just as Deku was then saying this is when suddenly he would then be enveloped by this weird sludge, causing him to be surprised. But right as Deku was getting enveloped in this weird sludge, this is when suddenly bursting down the door would be none other than All Might and the rest of the heroes. And when All Might arrives, he sees Deku getting enveloped by this sludge as he calls out to him, but unfortunately it was too late, as Deku would end up getting teleported away, and he was not the only one, as the other villains that were unconscious would also be teleported away, as All Might ends up cursing. As we now end up changing scenes. So turning our attention to somewhere else, this is where we end up seeing Deku as he ends up waking up into this weird dark area. As in this area, Deku would be surrounded by multiple different pods of Nomus as he looks around in confusion. But just as Deku was trying to comprehend exactly where he was, this is when suddenly a voice then calls him out from the darkness. As Deku would then turn around to see none other than All For One, in his suit and everything. As he tells Deku that he was quite unpleased by how Deku was acting, as this is when Deku would then rush out All For One, trying to throw a punch, only for him to send a generous burst of wind back, causing a generous explosion and also catching the attention of other heroes that were right outside the area, as this would be the warehouse. Now when Deku gets sent flying out, this is when Best Genius and the other heroes that were there will then try to apprehend All For One, as they are able to sense that something is wrong with that man. But All For One, obviously being way too powerful for them, immediately ends up putting a stop to it, dealing some fatal damage to Best Genius and also damaging the other heroes as well. Now Deku, after recovering from the blow he just got, will end up getting up as he sees All For One looming over him as he just casually floats in the air menacingly. As All For One would then casually tell Deku that he'll be taking his quirk now. As just like that, we would then see these weird tendrils then be released from the tip of All For One's fingers as they rush at Deku, only for Deku to then suddenly speed blitz them, surprising All For One. As this is when Deku would then firmly release a large battle cry, as this battle cry would also come in with a generous amount of Conqueror's Haki, causing All For One to actually sway off his path and actually be stunned by it, and allowing Deku to land him with a powerful gut punch, sending him flying. Now once again, this would catch the attention of the heroes, as just like that, many of them would end up arriving on the scene. as Deku would be seen just casually standing on top of the rubble as he stares down at All For One, who was still on the ground. Before All For One would then suddenly pick himself up, scratching the dust that he'd gotten after collapsing down to the ground like that, as he ends up telling Deku that that was a bad move. As just like that, this is where we would then get the fight between Deku versus All For One. As the fight would first start off with Deku rushing over at All For One, charging both of his fists towards him as he tries to attack him, only for All For One to dodge as he ends up sending out a ginormous wind blast, sending Deku away. And while this was happening, this is when he would also use the tendrils once again as he tries to steal Deku's quirk. But the thing is, when these tendrils end up hitting Deku, to the surprise of All For One, they end up breaking as soon as they end up making contact with Deku's skin, as he ends up realizing that Deku was way tougher than he thought, and that he may need even more power just to steal his quirk, which he had more than enough to spare. As just like that, as Deku ends up recovering from the wind blast, he would then rush out All For One once again, as the two of them begin to exchange blows. And to the surprise of Deku, All For One was able to actually withstand his punches. And by that I mean he is actually able to contend, as he seems to be on equal level to that of All Might, if not maybe even superior. But right before Deku can really think on that way too much, this is when suddenly All For One then begins to maneuver Deku throughout the air, as Deku would then be dealt multiple blows, as All For One will be toying with him as he ends up making sure that Deku doesn't touch the ground, since that's where he thought that Deku was at his strongest. As for the next few moments, we would see Deku stuck in the air, as All For One will be doing nothing more but throwing combos after combos against Deku, with Deku just simply tanking them, as that's really the only thing he could really do. Or at least that's what All For One had thought. As he tries to load up another punch at Deku trying to send him flying, this is when Deku then releases the Conqueror Spear once again, causing All For One to be stunned by it, and also giving Deku the opportunity to land him with a powerful kick to the head, causing All For One to be rocketing into the ground. As following right after he lands there being a ginormous amount of dust that ends up packing up the entire area. As we see Deku just casually landing on the ground, as he ends up glaring angrily at All For One, who ends up collecting himself once again, telling Deku that he was starting to have enough of him, with Deku telling All For One casually that he doesn't give a damn what he thinks and that he's gonna win this fight. As we end up seeing the two of them then once again charge up, as both of them were about to dash at each other once again, until All Might comes out of nowhere and rushes at All For One, trying to get that one last fight in. But unfortunately for All Might, All For One had no time for him. In fact, he was too focused on his latest subject and possibly his latest vessel, as this is when he then ends up summoning out a bunch of Nomus, stacking them on top of All Might and causing him to sway off the path. As this is when All For One would then simply chuckle, telling All Might that he was still too weak, as he ends up blasting All Might away and causing the rest of the Nomu to once again continue to be sent flying at All Might, causing him to be distracted, and once again allowing All For One to fight against Deku. Now Deku seeing this couldn't believe it, as he can't believe just how easily All For One was able to deal with All Might like that. But right before he can really think about it too much, once again All For One tries to bring Deku into the air, which Deku is able to dodge once again as the two of them pick up on their fight. As right now it just looks like pure chaos was happening, as the entire area that they were in had turned into a complete battlefield, as you see both All For One and Deku exchanging blows, with both of them bouncing from place to place as they would cause damage each time they would land. As we see both fighters giving some of their best efforts in this fight as they try to overpower the other one. And All For One, the more times he continues fighting Deku, the more times he's basically enamored with the quirk. He couldn't believe that this quirk made this boy so strong, as he wonders if it was indestructibility or if it was like just its maximum durability. He didn't know what it was, but now he wanted it more than anything. As after one last collision and causing much more shockwaves and destruction everywhere, this is when finally, as both of them would separate, this is when All For One would then compliment Deku for lasting this long, as this is when suddenly he would then show Deku a token of appreciation by deciding to give it all he's got, telling Deku that after this is done, he'll make sure to put his quirk to good use. But Deku, after hearing this, says nothing more as he casually ends up picking himself off the ground, as this is when suddenly he would then say that he has enough, as this is when Deku finally stops holding back. As this is when suddenly we would then see Deku then transform into his half-dragon form right in front of All For One, as he begins to explain to All For One about the toll that this ability has on him. Basically, since Deku is still a teenager and everything, and since he hasn't reached his maximum potential, this form takes quite a toll on him considering the fact that he loses control. As you know how Deku has a very large hunger for battle, well this ends up amplifying it. Since he ends up turning into technically a half animal and everything, his instincts go even further. And that meant that Deku has much more of a hard time controlling his urges, whether it be simply sleeping mid-fight or just going completely wild enough to the point where he just causes collateral damage for the sake of causing damage. So yeah, Deku has very limited control on this considering the fact that he's still young. but just the form alone was able to catch All For One's attention, as he could just sense the imposing power from it. He ends up laughing a little bit, already thinking about what he could do with that quirk, as this is when he would then rush at Deku, trying to hit him, only for Deku to then casually sidestep him. As this is when he then tells All For One that he has no idea just how outmatched he was. As this is when Deku would then hit All For One with another powerful wave of Conqueror's Haki, but this one being way stronger than he's ever been hit before, causing All For One to literally fall unconscious and giving Deku an opportunity to land a clean blow. As Deku would move his fist so fast that to most it was literally unforeseeable, and even to those that are experienced, they could just barely keep track of it. As this is where we will then see Deku land a powerful punch into All For One's stomach, and causing him to then be slammed into the ground hard, causing a ginormous crater to appear and even more damage to happen across the surrounding area, as a ginormous wind would be so powerful that the helicopter that was watching everything would then be pushed back as well, as everyone watching can help but actually shake in terror at just how powerful these two were. As Deku himself will be looking at All For One, as All For One would just be there completely stunned by just how powerful it was, this is when he would then make one last battle attempt to stand up, one last charge, one last stand, as he ends up putting every last quirk that he had stole into both of his fists. As with a shaky breath, this is when All For One would then charge at Deku as he tries to throw a punch, with Deku doing the same thing. As just like that, right in front of everyone's eyes, they will then see two of the strongest individuals that most people have seen in their entire lives, and possibly some of the strongest individuals in just the entire world of MHA, would then end up clashing with each other, with this attack being so powerful that legit split the skies. As we end up seeing Deku's Conqueror's Haki going crazy by this point, as he ends up giving this punch all he's got, although All For One will then be surprised as he would then see his body then be ripped apart, as cracks soon begin to form and actually spread across his arm and his body, as All For One couldn't believe it. He couldn't understand it, as the very last thought he thinks in his mind is how could someone actually best him? As in his very last final moments, we will see All For One then look into Deku's eyes, and when he does, he would then see it. Someone who was meant to conquer the entire world. As we see the Supreme King's Haki going crazy, as this is when All For One finally realizes that he wasn't defeated by a boy or a man, he was defeated by a literal beast. As just like that, this is where we will then see the end of All For One, as we end up seeing his body be completely destroyed after the collision, as a large amount of dust would then fill up the entire area, causing everyone to wonder exactly what went down. But soon, after the dust then begins to settle, this is when suddenly they'll then get a clear look at it, as casually standing there, being the only one left standing after the battle between him and All For One, would be none other than Deku. As we see him casually stare up into the sky, as this is when the cameraman then announces that the fight between these two powerful individuals were finally over. As all the while this was happening, we see All Might, as by this point he couldn't hold on to the transformation any longer, but he had been there to witness it, as he had saw his most biggest enemy and the one who was a threat to the entire world had been successfully defeated by nothing more but a child. And just thinking about it, All Might would then begin to actually laugh, as he can't help but finally think in his mind that finally All For One was gone, as he ends up looking at Izuku Midoriya before thanking him in his mind, as this is where we would end up seeing many heroes arrive onto the scene, as they would then try their best to help out any survivors of the fight, with even some of them going after Deku to see if he was okay, and also to wonder who exactly he was. As just like that, this is where we end up doing a final time skip. So by this point now, we're going to be flashing forward through multiple years now after the battle between All For One. By this point, now that All For One's evil has been vanquished, finally things were able to settle out peacefully. And that was not the only thing, as the League of Villains had also been captured as well. As thanks to Deku being able to knock them out before they got a chance to be a real threat, and thanks to All For One being, killed, they're basically just sitting ducks. So the heroes were able to capture them and restrain him. Now Shigaraki, after waking up and finding out that his father was gone, would be going like a madman, like a literal Joker type madness. But unfortunately, there was nothing he could do. He was already restrained, he was already captured, and that was it. There was nothing else. And soon afterwards, after interrogating the League of Villains, they were soon able to find out all of All For One's resources and where exactly he was able to do all his operations, as they began to raid it and actually capture everyone that was working for All For One, putting really an end to his evil tapestry. Now by this point, if you're wondering about what happens to certain events, I'm going to go ahead and make it very clear. Shiosaki, or better yet known as Overhaul, he does end up getting captured, as while he wasn't really too much working with All For One and everything, he did actually already have a contract on standby to work for him, and All For One was able to see it, and more importantly, the rest of the heroes had been able to see it. So seeing that he was actually about to go into business with Shigaraki, and after investigating him, this is where we will then see Overhaul then get captured and as well as arrested, and also allowing Eri to then be free. And now throughout these years, we will also see the rest of Class 1A, as many of them were able to graduate and many of them continue on with their lives, some going out to become heroes, with others following other careers, but also having heroes as like a side job pretty much. And pretty much things going pretty good in the future, as we end up seeing that Bakugo actually ends up competing for number 1 with 2 others, this being Todoroki and also Mirio. As by this point, the new user of One For All has been revealed, and he's already been making multiple headways, but Bakugo as well as Todoroki were not letting themselves fall behind. And finally, this only ends up leaving off with one person. What exactly happened to Deku throughout all this time? Well, Deku actually decided to live his life in his own way, as after all, he didn't want to be restrained by this system and everything, so this is where he finally ends up deciding his own path, as he decides to travel around the world, finding stronger opponents, going out on adventures, and even finding riches. As the last scene from this what if that we end up seeing would be none other than Deku, as we see him casually standing on top of the mountaintop as he ends up laughing at the top of his lungs as he prepares for his very next big adventure. As now with that being said, this will be the end to what if Deku had Kaidou's abilities. Thank y'all so much for tuning into this what if. This what if took a long time, alright? And I do want to apologize so much for, being away for a month and a half. Yeah, it was rough, guys. I kid you not. I was trying my best to record, but I kept traveling. And by the time I finally got a chance to record, I didn't know what if to do. Alright? Because trust me, I was actually going to post another what if besides this one. But that what if idea got scrapped very quickly because I didn't know how to write it. And speaking of this one I was just barely able to continue it, considering the fact that it's been so long since I've done a what if that I legit was struggling exactly how to go about it. Like this one, I literally was not able to even make a script about it. Like it was crazy, y'all. And yeah, I was stuttering so much making this video. It was hard to continue on going with the constant flow. And yeah, basically your boy got incredibly rusty after going on a very, very long break, and he apologizes for it. But hey, now that I made this what if, I'm slowly going to get back into the rhythm of it, slowly going to get my flow back, and eventually things are going to go up to schedule, so don't worry. Yeah, I'm coming back, alright, I'm coming back. You guys don't got to worry about that. But for now, y'all, it's your host, Seiji Samurai. It's very late right now. In fact, I have to go to bed. So with that being said, peace and have a lovely day.
Colors, switch the color, 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 switch it, switch it.